Hi, everybody.
Hello there. Good morning.
We wanted to give you a chance to put a face to the names, but that's enough of our faces. So I'm glad everyone is joining us this morning.
Good morning. My name is Anil Baines, and I'm the Manager of Clinical Services at Diversity. And I work in collaboration with Karina, who you also met, and who will be talking a little bit more after I finish. We support the various counseling programs at Diversity. I primarily provide clinical supervision to the counseling staff.
And as Anil mentioned, I'm Karina Carroll, and I'm the Manager of Counseling Services with Diversity. Diversity is based in Surrey, for those of you who are unfamiliar with us. We offer a spectrum of services in Surrey, White Rock, Delta, and Langley. Some of you might be familiar with the concept of wraparound service, which is what we can provide here at Diversity through our employment programs, settlement and community program, moving ahead, language training and literacy, programs for children and youth, counseling services, and interpretation and translation. So I bet everyone was excited when they saw the title of this webinar, because I would have been as well. And I don't know that the idea of trauma-informed practice is new, but it has become more formalized and certainly more aligned with what we might call best practices. With our work, we decided to look more specifically at trauma-informed practice within the context of immigrant and refugee populations. Anil and I are not experts, but we are hoping that with our constantly growing knowledge and experience, we can share information that is more relatable and provide you with a bit of a framework that encourages you to look into more formal training. Because we respect the level of training provided for formal trauma-informed practice, we feel it is important that we are clear that today is a first step in what we hope is ongoing training and knowledge exchange. So I'm going to share the agenda, I think. Oops. Sorry, we skipped ahead there. Can we skip back to the agenda slide, possible? Thank you. So our agenda today is intended to be broader in scope, and it's quite a full agenda, so if we're moving too quickly, by all means, please write a message in the box so that we can see that we need to slow down. Some of you may be looking for more practical skills for your work, but we feel it's necessary to start with the basics, and through that we encourage you to get involved in learning more. I will, however, make some brief comments about trauma-informed practice. Being trauma-informed does not necessarily mean that your work is focused on trauma. It means that you're committed as an individual and hopefully as an agency in acknowledging that many of our clients are impacted by trauma and our services are sensitive to their needs. Being trauma-informed means we see behaviors as symptoms of something at the core. The clinic toolkit, which is a reference that we use quite often through this webinar, challenges us to see a person with an injury as opposed to a person who is sick. The difference is in the way we see the situation. An injury is something that happened to someone, and our inquiry with that person is more about what happened to them rather than what is wrong with them. We feel that to get on the road to becoming trauma-informed, we can start with building your awareness about trauma and its impact. So you'll see the agenda on the screen. And as Sabrina mentioned, we will have a break during the session for a check-in and some questions, as well as time at the end for further discussion. And so now I'm going to ask Anil to step in and start talking about what constitutes a traumatic event.
Okay. So what is trauma? And we can go to the next slide here. Thank you. The more formal definition is what you can see. Traumatic event involves a single experience or enduring, repeated, or multiple experiences that completely overwhelm the individual's ability to cope or integrate the ideas and emotions involved in that experience. It's a bit of a mouthful, so breaking it down further, the three main points that distinguish trauma are: one, it's unexpected or unpredictable. The person impacted was not prepared, and it is beyond the control of the person affected. So the traumatic experience is unexpected, the person is not prepared for it, and is beyond their control. In my terms, I would describe trauma as any experience that a person has gone through that is painful or distressing, that even though the experience in itself is over, the fact that the person has gone through that event, there is a tendency for there to be a continued impact or effect on that person, even if that experience was 5, 10, 20 years ago. So trauma is an unexpected event that is upsetting to and beyond the control of the person's coping mechanism that does not get resolved at that time. For example, you can be in a car accident and have to deal with the physical trauma that may occur, but if the event was not handled properly or there was inappropriate support given at that time of the incident or following it, that additional emotional trauma can settle into the body, resulting in longer lasting effects. If the event is not processed properly or resolved, it can add further devastation to the person. Hence, it is very important that those supporting clients who have experienced trauma are aware of how they are working with these individuals. Otherwise, those already traumatized are at risk of being re-traumatized in every social service and healthcare setting that they are part of. A few other points to consider, and I'm sorry, some of this info didn't make it onto the slides, so if you're looking at it, it's not there. Trauma is very complex with many layers and multi-dimensional. Trauma events can happen to all people. No one is immune. This experience usually involves a threat to one's physical or emotional well-being. It is overwhelming and leaves the person feeling helpless, lacking control, with resulting physical stress reactions, which Karina will talk more about shortly. It can prevent one from fully engaging in the present and continue to be locked in the past. Most importantly, it changes the way a person understands themselves, the world, and others. There is a significant shift in one feeling safe and secure in this world. Peter Levine has written a book called Healing Trauma. In it, he talks about trauma being a loss of connection. He states that there is this loss of connection to ourselves, to our bodies, to our families, to others, and to the world around us. This loss of connection is usually hard to recognize because it doesn't happen all at once. It can happen slowly, over time, and we adapt to these subtle changes, sometimes without even noticing them. These are the hidden effects of trauma, the ones that most of us keep to ourselves. One may sense that he or she does not feel quite right without really being fully aware of what is taking place. There's a gradual undermining of one's self-esteem, self-confidence, and connection to life. It is very difficult for trauma to just heal back to a normal, healthy state gradually over time.
So you'll see a slide in front of you that describes trauma by the Center for Addiction and Mental Health as trauma is the emotional response when a negative event is overwhelming. The trauma toolkit goes on to talk about trauma as it lives in the nervous system. And we have these instinctual reactions to traumatic events. And certainly we have people that are trained in managing those type of critical events or traumatic events. But for most of us, if we were faced with something very traumatic, this is what we might see, the body reacting immediately to what it perceives as danger, and our brain is unable to catch up to find what's going on or to convince our body that we're safe or that we can manage what's happening. So those things can happen through distressing events, and they can also happen, those reactions can happen during triggering events. Sorry, our slides are a little bit slow. So it's important to understand that everyone's response is different. Although there may be some themes within certain families or certain groups, responses are individual. Some of you may be familiar with the terms fight, flight, or freeze. Those are terms used to describe a response to a critical incident or traumatic event during the actual event. They are typically the initial response, but can also be present when there is a triggering event. To help you understand what we mean by fight, flight, or freeze, I'm going to refer to traumarecovery.ca, and they describe some of the behaviors or how fight, flight, or freeze is demonstrated. Fight response includes crying, clenching of fists, the desire to hit or punch, a tight or flexed jaw, grinding of the teeth. The eyes look like there's a fight about to happen, glaring. The voice may become more harsh. There's a desire to stomp or kick. Feelings of anger and rage. Thoughts of homicidal or suicidal feelings. A knotted stomach, nausea, burning stomach, and using metaphors like bombs, volcanoes erupting. Some of the behaviors that are associated with the flight response are restless legs, feet, numbness in legs, anxiety and shallow breathing, darting eyes, leg and foot movement. Probably you've seen it where people are shaking their legs. Reported or observed fidgetiness, restlessness, tension, a sense of running, and excessive exercise. Freeze responses could be when someone feels stuck in a part of their body, when they feel cold or numb, they might feel stiff or heavy, they're holding their breath or restricting their own breathing, they have a sense of dread, their heart could start to pound, their heart rate could actually increase or decrease, and they don't have an orientation to the threat. So it's also important to keep in mind that even when a traumatic event happens, it's not just the person who's directly affected. For those of you that are parents, I'm sure you could imagine how you would be impacted if you saw your child going through something traumatic. Certainly we see that with family members, close friends, and even witnesses to traumatic experiences. So some of the symptoms that we see with trauma extend into all parts of us. So it's not everyone will experience a traumatic event as trauma. So keep in mind that what we're talking about are the symptoms that would be present in someone who is. And again, this is not during the event. So, and this often will, these symptoms will be in place well after the event. So it could be 2 to 3 months. We have physical symptoms such as headaches and body aches, trouble sleeping, heart palpitations, and certainly the immune system becomes compromised. We also have emotional symptoms. Such as excessive worrying, nervousness, mood instability or a flattened mood, experiencing shame or guilt, and minimizing the event and the impact it had on us. Behavioral symptoms such as hypervigilance, avoiding reminders of that event, so such as avoiding people, avoiding going to certain places. You know, we certainly know of people that have caught maybe 3 buses instead of 1 bus to avoid a certain area. Substance use and isolation. Some of the mental symptoms are difficulty with focusing, confusion, and thoughts that are related to the experience that we can't control from coming into our minds. So we've covered, you know, about maybe not even half of what we're going to cover today. So here's a chance to ask some questions or get clarifications on anything.
Thank you so much for what you've covered so far. The first comments that we've received are, I've learned so much in this first little part of this webinar, so I do encourage everyone to post their questions if they have any questions. And so far we haven't received questions that, so but I'll give it another minute. So I think what we maybe want to do is is just move on to the next section, and then we can maybe check in to see if then there's some further questions or clarifications needed.
Great.
Sounds good.
Okay. So Anil's going to talk a little bit about PTSD and complex PTSD.
Okay. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a natural emotional reaction to experiences that involve actual or threatened harm to oneself or others. So PTSD are the symptoms that people experience when they have gone through a traumatic incident. These symptoms can be mild, moderate, or severe. One may experience feelings of shame, guilt, anxiety, helplessness, or irritation, or they can result in forgetfulness, sleep difficulties, nightmares, unwanted memories, or flashbacks. PTSD can affect anyone. PTSD usually appears within 3 months of the event. Chronic PTSD lasts more than 3 months. The symptoms of PTSD are pretty much the same in all cultures. However, how the symptoms are described and expressed may vary from one culture to another. Children and adults may not show the same signs of PTSD, and children may respond differently to traumatic events depending on their understanding and age. Complex PTSD, these symptoms typically occur when the source of the trauma happened when one was young, or if it took place over a prolonged period of time. For example, a person being held hostage for a number of days or months, where one had to behave in a certain way in order to ensure his or her survival. So complex PTSD is also known as a disorder of extreme stress, and it takes a while to develop in a person. When we talk about dealing with complex trauma, there needs to be a comprehensive and sequenced treatment plan, which involves multiple components that target the different symptoms that arise on the person's road to recovery. The person needs to not only learn how to manage symptoms such as flashbacks, nightmares, but also needs to learn relational skills around trust and intimacy because of the complexity of the trauma and the changes in one's self-concept, sense of self that occurs. So, if you have a client or someone who's been diagnosed with complex PTSD, it would be beneficial to get a certified clinician or consult with someone who can help you service or provide service to this person.
One thing I will add is now, thanks to the provincial hotline, that is a resource for people. So if you are working with individuals who have been, that you're aware of, that have PTSD and especially complex PTSD, we would encourage you to use that hotline to ensure that you're able to provide the service that you need, as it can present in a myriad of ways. So it's not always everyone's issue to have to take that on. That's quite complex. So okay, so when we are looking at, we've talked about a traumatic event, we've talked about trauma as far as the initial response, we've talked about what happens in physically, mentally, emotionally, and behaviorally when someone has trauma. Anil's talked about PTSD and complex PTSD. And now you're probably wondering how we look at trauma in relation to our immigrant and refugee populations. So here's some considerations, and of course we're well aware that a lot of you will already know this information doing the work that you do, but it is always important to take into consideration what kind of factors could be impacting our clients at different stages. So during pre-migration, we see potentially there's been war in the country, political unrest, poverty, persecution, human rights violations that include execution of family members or friends without due process. So you know, there's some frightening things: internal displacement, violence, and health issues. Certainly when we are looking at pre-migration factors, this list doesn't include what could have happened during childhood, which Anil made reference to, where there may have been situations of childhood abuse or violence in the home or death. We would see certainly those factors being compounded by then secondary and third experiences of the types of things listed here. Then when we look at what happens during migration, we are going to have considerations of external displacement, loss of family members and friends, loss of employment, home, belongings, sense of despair or disbelief. Certainly, I'm sure you're all have worked with someone who has a desire to return home. People make their way into refugee camps, and we understand that the structure and safety of the refugee camps vary, and certainly there can be risks associated with the camps. There's health risks, violence in camps, uncertainty about the future, and we do know of incidents of exploitation. We're going to move now to look at the resettlement stage. So I know that we all have kind of a timeline that we follow as far as settlement services, but we have to keep in mind that the resettlement stage is really an individual timeline. Regardless of how long services are in place for, the individual will take as much time as they need to achieve settlement or integration. And when we consider some of the factors that we're talking about today, it will help explain why some people may take longer than others to integrate. So some of the things that are experienced during the resettlement stage or discrimination, the economic pressures, including employment or low employment, a loss of assets, the cost of living, loan repayments. We also look at the stigma related to mental health and support. There's a level of distrust that can be in place. We have language and literacy issues, and we have a fear of deportation. Certainly we see that within our counseling services department, that we have people who have expressed a fear of truly talking about what's going on because they think that it can be reported and that their immigration status can be affected by that. So if we could move on to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of culture and religion. So we work with consideration of all the factors we've reviewed so far, and then we also have to see trauma in the context of culture and or belief systems. How do our clients view trauma or distress? What are some of the acceptable ways they have of managing distress? When we become trauma aware and eventually trauma informed, we also commit to becoming culturally competent, and more than that, culturally safe in our organizations. When you look at cultural and religious norms or traditions, we can work from a strength-based perspective, and that's what Anil's going to go into a bit more detail about resiliency and protective factors.
Thanks, Karina. There is a shift happening on how we view trauma. We need to view the client not as sick, resistant, or uncooperative, but as affected by injury, as Karina mentioned earlier on. This will shift the conversation from, instead of what is wrong with you, we would ask, what happened to you? When you approach working with clients in this manner, it will allow you to engage with the client in a way that will create a climate of hope and resilience, moving towards a strength-based perspective. Here are a few questions that I would like you to ask yourself when working with your clients. You can maybe take a pen and write this down if you're not. Are you acknowledging the strength it took for your client to get where they are at now? Are you letting them know that healing and recovery is possible? Are you acknowledging the client's ability to survive and grow from that experience? Are you helping the client to view trauma as an injury, something that requires time and support to heal? Are you separating the traumatic event from the person's response to that event? This helps the client to be able to separate what they can control from what they can't control, instead of it all being in the same category? Are you letting the client know that the traumatic experience does not define them or their life or lives? Are you helping the client to move beyond survival, helping them to determine a path by identifying specific coping mechanisms that they can use? And so now we'll move to the next slide. So the use of language is very important in working with clients who have experienced trauma. One can destigmatize and normalize the person's responses to trauma and reframe it from a strength-based approach. As I mentioned previously, are you asking what has happened or what is wrong with you? And are you helping the client make that distinction? As professionals, how do we view our clients? And here are a few things to consider. Clients who come to see you who may be attempting to assert their power in the only way they know, but we may label them as controlling. Or those clients who may be having difficulty asking directly for what it is they want, but we may label them as being manipulative. There's clients who may be trying to connect with you or seeking help, but we may label them as attention-seeking. Then we have clients who may be feeling hopeless or depressed, and we may label them as lazy. Clients who may not be forthcoming with personal information, just a little bit more private, when they're just feeling anxious or fearful. And there's clients who may be labeled as detached, when they are just physically numb from the trauma they experienced. So the way that you use your language and have a discussion about trauma that has taken place will help the client to be able to engage, be in the present, and also prevent the client from having a traumatic stress response. Pacing and timing of giving the client information, deciding when they are ready to receive new information, normalizing their experience, and helping them understand their reactions will contribute to the client feeling more confident in managing their experiences.
I just want to add, so the terms that you see on your screen right now, those are terms that we've actually heard from professionals when they're describing the clients that they've referred for service. So these are real life examples of terms that have been used.
And so now we'll go to potential trauma triggers on the following slide. People may be triggered by anniversary dates, seeing or reading a news report, seeing a person associated with the trauma, or nightmares. Even certain sounds, smells, or sights can remind a person of the traumatic event. It's important to be aware that clients may be triggered and to have interventions in place depending on your role in supporting the client. For example, what can you do in that moment? Who can you consult with? And who you can refer the client to. This is where counseling would be beneficial to help the client manage these stressors more effectively when they do occur. And I'll pass it back to Karina now.
Okay, so if we could move to the next slide. So the question you might have at this point is, why is it important that we're aware of trauma, and how does it impact our clients? And what is it that you can do in your work? So although we can't go into specific tools that we can give you in your work, because there's a range of people joining us today, we can go over a brief chart, and certainly this doesn't include everything. These are just some examples of, where we want to use empathy as opposed to pity. We want to recognize strengths and not just focus on challenges. We want to work with a client or alongside that client, and we don't want to push for the story or push for the results. One thing I like to say about people is that if they could do more, they would do more. And what we don't want to do is criticize the progress that clients are making. We want to be collaborative in our problem solving instead of directing specific support that they're not ready for. And I want to add something about that. In our experience, we've actually received counseling referrals for people that are unaware that the referral was made and unaware of the reasons that it was made. And so what we would encourage a more collaborative approach where there's a conversation that's happening. And some of that I was asked the other day is, how would you engage someone who is resistant to counseling? I think that we can do it in a respectful way. And one thing, the example I gave was having the conversation to say, I want to tell you that I want you to get support, the support that you deserve, and I'm hoping you'll consider a recommendation that I have, rather than going more specific or more directive and saying, I'm referring you for counseling services. And we also have to accept that even though we want them to get involved in other services, they may not be ready for them, and so the services will not be useful to them until they're actually ready to participate in those services. And then the final point is just being genuine instead of being the expert. So it's, you know, none of us are perfect, none of us are experts in every single human being, and I think that being genuine can take you a lot further, and when you're genuinely concerned about your clients, it shows through your practice. So if we could move to the next slide, we're going to go over a few examples of what some of the coping mechanisms are that you may have seen, and certainly you've probably seen other ones. Some of the negative coping mechanisms under substance use would be binge drinking, getting intoxicated, to the point where there's relationships that are in jeopardy. There might be memory loss due to substance use or loss of employment. One thing we want to make sure people understand is prescription medication is another area that's being utilized where some of the psychological impacts are being felt physically, and people are being able to get prescriptions given to them on a longer term basis, and so we do see prescription medication addiction. Another negative coping mechanism is isolation. And again, we're talking about coping mechanisms that are not short-term, these are longer-term, where isolation might result also in loss of employment, where they disengage from normal activities that they once enjoyed, or they're letting go of significant relationships. And preoccupation with the source of trauma is really about when it becomes all-consuming. So of course, people have very positive coping mechanisms, and these are things to build on with your clients when you're looking for ways that they can find support. If they have a good peer network or a support network through family and friends, if through their spiritual practice they can find solace and find support, joining support groups, and certainly going to counseling, and that's not a plug for our services, it's actually a positive coping mechanism. And so, like I said, you probably have your own examples, and I think it's important to note that when we see a negative coping mechanism, we really do mean something that is affecting their daily life, their ability to enjoy life, and it's on a longer term period. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Now, Anil's going to talk a bit about vicarious trauma, because we think it's important that all of you are supported in the work that you do.
Okay, so vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, burnout are all related terms that you may have heard before. Vicarious trauma refers to the cumulative, transformative effect on the helper working with survivors of traumatic life events. It is the emotional duress that results when an individual hears about the first-hand trauma experiences of another. Its symptoms may mimic those of PTSD. For example, one may notice an increase in physiological arousal and avoidance reactions related to the indirect trauma exposure. A common symptom of vicarious trauma is social withdrawal, isolation, or disconnection. Spiritual disruption is another symptom. This is where we lose that sense of nurturance, or we start asking, what is the meaning of the work that I'm doing? That is usually a symptom of vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is the cost of caring for and caring about people who have been traumatized. When we empathically engage with clients, when we have committed to a sense of responsibility in working with a client, or in a sense we open our hearts to those who have suffered a great deal of pain through violence and or victimization, we need to think about how we open our hearts and minds and perform it in a way that helps protect us. For example, instead of visualizing what happened to a client as if it happened to ourselves, it is healthier to focus on imagining what it must have been like for that person or this community to go through that experience, and then place focus on how they survived. What were the strengths and resources that helped them through that experience? It is vital that you have identified what your role is and what your boundaries are in order to ensure the best practices of self-care and be less vulnerable to vicarious trauma. An easy way to remember how to check and see if you are managing the impact of vicarious trauma is to remember your ABCs. So, is there an awareness of your needs, emotions, and limits? Are you able to find balance between your work, rest, and play? And do you feel a connection to yourself, to others, and or something greater, for example, spiritually? I would ask everyone and throw out the question who's listening today, if you have ongoing consistent supervision, whether it's individual or in a group, and if you're not getting appropriate supervision and are working with clients who've experienced trauma, I would recommend to find out how you can make this part of your work, that is, as it's vital to maintaining balance and self-care. I know we have a lot of time left, so
I think that we're moving on to some self-reflection questions, and so this might be something that I think there's a lot of people that are listening to the webinar in groups. And so, Sabrina, I don't know if there's an opportunity for people to comment on these reflection questions through the webinar, but certainly if we move to the next slide, these are questions that we wanted to have you consider that are relevant to your work. And so there might be a little bit of a conversation that can happen with the people you're watching this webinar with, but we'd love to hear from people as well through the chat.
And the other thing, we've touched on a number of different topics here. Each topic, for example, vicarious trauma, you can have a full-day workshop on, or PTSD and complex trauma, it's a full day. So we've taken pieces, a number of different pieces, and have tied them into a short time. So one of our goals was for you to define which areas you would want more training on, which would be beneficial for your organization, and then make that happen. Okay, so we'll move towards the self-reflection piece, and these are just a few questions that hopefully you can tie in to the learning that's taken place. So one is, what model of assessment are you currently using in your delivery of services to immigrants and refugees? What changes would you make based on what you've heard today? From a strength-based perspective, what is one strength of yours that you can utilize in working with this population who have experienced or are experiencing symptoms of trauma? Through some of the information today that may be new to you, have you discovered a blind spot in terms of how you have been working with clients, or something that you haven't been considering? And if there's that, what else may also exist? What learning will you share with your colleagues who could not participate in the webinar? So what's something that stuck for you that you can take back to your organization and share that would be beneficial for your team or for your agency? And overall, how will the information presented in this webinar change the way you work with your clients?
So we can leave that with you, and certainly if anyone has comments that they want to make on that, we're happy to see them. We are, the next slide was more about some recommended readings that we have that we used as references within our webinar. And, one thing that we have to tell people is that, you gain some level of knowledge through various sources. And so And Neil and I are very blessed to have a couple of teams of staff, well, a lot of staff that can share their experiences, and there's a lot of dialogue that happens here at Diversity when we're talking about clients and their needs. And so we're in a unique position where we get to hear that information and then pull it together and then supplement it with some of the research that's been done and some of the best practices that are available for us to reflect on. So it really is about pulling together from everyone, and as I said earlier, we're not the experts. We have some tremendous staff that have a level of expertise in working with clients that we tap into every day, and so some of this you will figure out for yourself. And when you're curious about stuff, again, I'll talk about the provincial hotline that's available for consultation, but also you can do some of your own research, and I just caution you to try and go with credible sources for your information. So if we could move to the next slide, those readings are actually listed there, and there's not very many because we didn't use very many, but the American Institutes for Research has a trauma-informed care for displaced populations report. The UNHCR has a report that is very recent. And I can't say enough about the Clinic Community Health Center trauma-informed toolkit, which I have found to be very, very helpful. And I very much appreciate that they also talk about specialized populations within the trauma-informed toolkit. So those are things that are available to you. They don't cost anything. You can access them online, and I think that they'll be very helpful. And you might have some other readings, and AMSA is working hard on getting a resource page on their website, and so that may be an area that if you find something that you want to share with your colleagues around the province and certainly beyond, that you can send that into AMSA and they can put it on the resource page. So if we move on to the final slide, we're going to talk about some next steps as far as what we recommend. And certainly these are lofty goals. So we're not assuming that you can go back to your work today and have these all in place, although that would be very nice. We would like to recommend that every agency adopts a commitment to trauma-informed practice, and that includes the full trauma-informed practice training. So there's trauma-informed practice training available, very limited when it comes to refugee and immigrant populations. However, that's something that certainly we're looking at, and whether or not we can support all of you in more in-depth training. When you adopt a trauma-informed practice philosophy within an agency, that means, from our perspective, that everyone from the first person that greets a client at the front desk all the way up to the top, to the executive director or CEO or board members, that everyone becomes trauma-informed. And that actually means that you're adopting the entire trauma-informed culture within your organization, and that you're supported in your professional development about maintaining your trauma-informed practice. The second recommendation that we would have, obviously, is continued provincially available training on best practices in working with immigrant and refugee populations. We're constantly learning, we're constantly developing our approaches, and so I think it's important that everyone has an opportunity to stay on top of what the best recommendations are as far as practice. And the third recommendation is looking at developing a community of practice model, either regionally or within smaller communities, where people can come together and dive fairly deeply into practice and talking about scenarios, looking into ways of improving services, looking at new research, looking at new skills and developing those. Some of you may have heard of a community of practice prior to the session. It may be new for some of you, but I encourage you to look into what that looks like, and I do think it's an opportunity at a very grassroots level to improve our services. So that's kind of it for us, guys.